Hi, welcome to another Photoshop tutorial. My name is Matt and I'm with Creative 8, and today I'm going to show you how to create this awesome freaking metal texture effect within Photoshop. This effect was seen on the X-Men Evolution movie poster, and the document that I have here is set to a print resolution, not very big, but as you can see I can zoom in quite a bit. I also have included within the description links to download this vector, which is the M here and the circle, as well as the original document that I'm working with here, so that if you wanted to follow along, you're more than welcome to do that, because I'm going to be walking through this with you, because I feel that if I were to try and create a tutorial and showing you how I made it, going through that with me, I wouldn't be able to show you as much as if I were to just go through this with you. So if you want to download the original and follow along, you can do that. The link's in the description. The vector is also in the description. I think I put it in a PSD file so that if you don't have Illustrator, you will be able to do this with just using Photoshop. And if you wanted to make your own, you're more than welcome to do that. So check the links for those files, and please also subscribe, like, comment on this video as we go along, and I hope you enjoy that. So let's get started. So the first thing when I made this was I needed to find a good metal texture, because if you look in the original X-Men document, it's or poster, not document, but the poster, it's got a very strong brushed metal effect to it, which I liked. I included a little bit more grunge here. You can see with these little streaks of grooved in metal. But anyways, I followed it closely, as closely as I could. I mean, it's not going to look exactly the same. But to get started with that, I started with a background, and by the background, I mean I'm talking about the background here. So let's see if I can just isolate the background, which is this here. So this is what I did. I created a gradient because in the document you can see there's kind of like this background, like it's opening up to something. So I just used a simple gradient with my gradient tool. I don't think I have that gradient, but it's just a simple, very warm yellow going out to a darker yellow, fading out to black. Okay, and then I used the render clouds effect, which is right here, render clouds. Make sure your foreground and background are set to black. Shortcut key D will automatically change that to it. And then I set the blending mode to overlay, so it kind of interacted with the gradient that I laid down. Okay. Now after that I had the background was kind of built, I went ahead, and this layer here is just the top part, and these other layers here are just, you know, the text and the various other elements that are missing that you can see. So going through that, the first thing you're going to want to do is probably set down a color for the background. And the color I used here was just a kind of cold blue, not too blue, because it's metal. Metal does kind of tend to be blue, but you don't want a very prominent or bright blue. And I'm using my key so you can see this is the color that I used here. So it's a hue of 227 with about 50% in the saturation and 20% brightness. So from there, I built up the texture. Now the texture in here, besides the texture file that's included in the link, all the other textures are made within Photoshop. So you just need, if you don't have a vector file, you just need the vector, and you just need the included texture file, and you're good to follow along. And that's this file here, which, you know, you can't really tell. But after I had set the color, you go ahead and create a metal grain effect. And this is achieved by going up to the filters and adding noise. If you want to learn how to create an awesome, simple metal texture, you just go up here, filter, noise, add noise, and I usually do Gaussian, and you can adjust the setting here, but you know, somewhere between 50 to 65% seems to work right. And after you apply the noise, you're going to come into blur and apply a motion blur to that. And there's a few textures I use, one for the background, which is behind the M, and then there's another metal texture like you're seeing here created the same way on top that's applied to the actual M and the circle, and that was created going in a different direction just to help it separate from the background. So it's not the same texture in that it's just, you know, the grains going in a different direction. So that's how you create a little simple metal texture within Photoshop, is just adding noise, going up to the motion blur, and adjusting the settings there. You will almost always have to, when doing this, adjust the brightness and or the levels and the contrast, however you want to call it, because it's never going to come out looking exactly like you want. And there's always these weird edges, things that are just super contrasty, so you're going to have to kind of scale it out when you get done. So that's how I created the metal textures here, and that's how you're going to create the metal textures when you're going through yours. So that's this file here, and I set that blending mode to linear light because I really wanted the highlights and the shadows to be put in there, and then I set its opacity to 33%. So after that, I'm kind of jumping around, but I went ahead and laid down this metal texture set to a multiply, which is the included metal texture in the link. And from there, you just kind of build on to it. So I think from there, I went on and I brought in the M so that I could see what it was kind of looking like, and did the same thing. I added a metal texture on top of it and got it kind of close to what I was thinking I wanted it to look like. And again, here's that metal texture. It's the same thing, but I just rotated it around so it doesn't look like it's exactly in the same spot as the background. And then from there, this is where you start adding in the lighting effects and, fine tuning the image. So I'll show you what was done from there. So after the metal texture was kind of established, I went through and added some additional lighting to the document to give it some greater depth. And that was achieved by taking this metal grain texture you see here, which, we just generated that, and I copied that by hitting Control A while that layer was selected, copied this entire layer, brought it over here into the channels, because what I did was I used this alpha channel here to create I think it was a black layer or a very dark gray image, which I'll show you how I did that here, that creates this additional little lighting effect that you see here, kind of as if some of these edges are really, really, really worn down and are showing the bare metal, and so they're very reflective, right? So to do that, I created a new layer, and I came up in here to image, or not image, what was it? Fill, and I think I just did a 50% gray. I could be wrong, but I just filled it with a 50% gray. I think I had a 50% opacity, which I don't want. So once that was in there, then I came up into render lighting effects, and make sure you're in an RGB color space. This doesn't seem to work, I think, with an RGB or 16-bit. And I just adjusted the light to the direction I wanted, which was, I think, coming down, because that's how the highlights are kind of going. And just to give it a little bit more. And then you come down here to this texture channel and make sure that alpha layer, that alpha channel, which is the copy of the metal grain, right here, and you just set the settings. You don't want it too blown out, and I just clicked OK, and that renders what you see here, and you see that. So it's a little different. I think I did a little bit darker, and I probably edited it with the levels adjustment afterwards, making sure that there was 100% black, and just simple things kind of like that. So anyways, that's how I achieved some additional little lighting effect onto the actual metal, and that was sent to a linear dodge add, because I'm not adding shadows, we're adding light to it, because the idea is that the light coming across this metal, it's going to be picking up where there's bare metal that's been recently, worn down or wiped off or scrapped or scraped, is going to be more reflective than the other parts. So I just wanted it to be a brightening mode or adding light to it. So that's what I did there. The opacity was set to 53, and then I just came in and started dodging and burning to kind of give it a little bit more mix up, so that it's not so CG generated. The other thing too, also I wanted to show you, was the shape layer here, which is that vector file in the description. I applied a stroke to it to kind of help establish where I was going to be making it look like that 3D bevel, and that was done by setting the fill type to gradient. And you need to make sure it's set to gradient, I think, but you do turn the style down to shape burst, and this will only really work with vector layers if there's a vector mask or something, whatnot like that. But what happens is the shape burst says, this gradient here, black to white, is going to be applied coming out from the vector, so it's going to be white here and black on the edge. And if I can maybe bring the opacity up, you can see how that is because it's set to multiply. But you see how this gradient is only being applied coming out from its edge. And I just wanted to add a little bit of lighting and shadow to that bevel because I know, being a large print document, I couldn't achieve that by using the bevel and emboss. So that's what was done here. That its size was 114 pixels, and that just helps establish the shading for the below layer, which is the bevel effect. And I'll just kind of see if I can pull that up so you can kind of see. And this is kind of out of order. This isn't the order I created it in, unfortunately, so that you can follow along. But that's kind of how it went. So this layer here is the actual shading of the layer. And what I did with that to get that selection was I actually came up here to the stroke and made it actually a solid color of red. And you can see that here. And the reason I did that was because I needed to have a selection, right? I needed to create a selection. So yeah, you just do that, and I came up to my filter color range and just selected that red color to give me a selection, and then it came down and created a new layer. And I'm sorry if this is pretty fast. I'm assuming you know Photoshop and have an understanding of it, because I would love to teach people Photoshop, but I'm assuming you have some understanding of Photoshop. So if it's moving fast, I apologize. I have some simpler videos, and maybe I'll make some more, but there's just plenty of those out there. So I'm assuming you have some knowledge of Photoshop before even starting with this. So anyways, with that selection, I just filled it with white, and that's how I got the layer here, which was used to go back, which is used to kind of establish the bevel effect. And there's a layer style applied to it, and this is where the drop shadow comes from. Here is from that layer. Okay, so and that's just simple multiply, just very typical. Okay, so after that, I applied another grainy texture to it, and this was the same thing as how the brushed metal was created, but instead of applying the lens motion blur, I just applied just a simple add noise, and then after, I think I came up and just blurred it a little bit, and I also decreased its value from 100% white to a little bit into a gray tone, because you're going to have difficulty. And this is one thing I couldn't figure out, was when I wanted to change the color of the grain, because I would often just come in here and do what was it? I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I would just come here and do colorize, and the problem with colorize is it won't cut. If something's 100% white, it's not going to add any color. So that was a little bit of a little challenge I had there in changing the color of the grain. So keep that in mind when you're doing that. But so it was just a grain file. And then I just came in and dodged and burned to give it the effect here. And this was achieved this was done by hand. So it was set to a hard light so that the shadows and highlights were being applied as if on a multiply and a screen effect, when I wouldn't need to have multiple layers. That's what the hard light blending mode does. If I'm wrong, correct me, but that's what it does that I've found. And the way that I was able to get these hard edges was I just grabbed my polygon lasso tool, and I literally would just come up here like this and just click and just make a very, very rough selection, and then grab my brush tool, making sure it was black and white, and I just came in here and painted around where I wanted the shadows, like this, just literally quite like that. And when I wanted to highlight, I would just come in and change it to white by pressing my shortcut X to swap the foreground and background. So that's how the lighting was done on this document. And let's undo it. So after the dodge and burn, I think that pretty much was all that was done to it. Just remember, you need to reduce the 100% whiteness from the grain into a gray to be able to get some blue colors going on in there. So after that, you can go around and do some more dodging and burning to the actual front piece of this document to give it some additional depth. And I applied a gradient here to kind of darken this edge, because the text layer was going to be here, and I wanted to make sure that text layer was going to pop out. And then after that, you just come in and start adding some gradients across the metal, because metal being flat, it's going to have some highlights and have some shadows, kind of like chrome or whatnot. And that was done by just creating a layer with white and grabbing my gradient tool, setting it to reflected, and just coming in and laying down a gradient across there. This was set to linear burn. I like linear burn more than multiply and various things because it kind of tends to interact with the saturation of the color a little better, and not so much with using the color dodge. So yeah, that's how the highlights were created, doing the same thing, just the opposite. The background started with a black, and then I had to use my levels to come in and kind of push them up so that they weren't pulling things so dark using the overlay. And then I also, to get a very sharp highlight that you see here when I'm turning this off and on, I just duplicated this layer and then adjusted the levels so that it narrowed it down, see there, like that. And then I think I just reduced the intensity of that, meaning this is the max output level. Remember, the output level is 50% gray, and that's how I achieved the layer above, which gives it the more sharper of the highlights. And I'm trying to think what else that you may need to know, but I hope that's kind of giving you an idea as to how this was made. So that's how the the metal effect was achieved. You just want to keep in mind you're going to use that texture file on top, setting it to, this one's set to multiply, and I think this one's set to overlay. It's a little different on each one, and that's all right. And keep in mind that the metal grain texture is created using the noise and a lens blur. So after the metal has been created, the edge highlights here, because the door, right, I grouped everything in, I'm sorry, I'm kind of probably starting a little bit, but the file was grouped so that I could put an image for a mask to kind of mask out that center area. And then I came in and just added the edge highlights, which was just a copy of the mask, and then I just did a stroke with a gradient here with the blue hues, and I just literally came in and had a predetermined gradient and just picked blues from the image itself to kind of match and give it give like it's a bevel. So there's the edge highlights. The glows here are created using a group, and I do a group because you can apply a group, with a blending mode, which I like. And I need to come in and turn on all these layers. So I don't know why this is here, but anyways, I'll just delete. So the glow, you're gonna, to create this, I guess I will show you a few things, is I come up and grab your elliptical marquee tool, and you just come right down the center and drag it out like that, and then you just fill it with white. And I come up and do a little blur, filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and however many you want. And then each one I duplicate that a few times, and then I just come in and I increase the width and the size, and usually the wider it goes, the smaller it gets down to. And I just do that a few times, and that gives me the final effect that you see here. So pretty easy and straightforward. Now to get the color, and this is why I do a group, is I group all these layers, and then I put a black color on the background. And this is important because I want this gradient map here and this hue and saturation adjustment layer to change the color. And I like this because maybe later on, if I don't like the color of the image, I want to be able to change it. And this allows me to come in and really quickly change that glow. And this works because the gradient, or the hue and saturation adjustment layer, looks for everything below it and says, let's adjust the colors. And if you don't have this black layer here, it's not going to work. You see that? Because remember, these are layers with transparency. That's 100% white pixels with transparency. So this glow is a white pixel that has more transparency. And the second you put a black background on it, it now looks at it saying, oh, this actually is a gray value, not a white color with a percentage of opacity. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you're grasping that and why this setup works the way it does. And I like it because I can adjust this later on with things, and it makes it pretty easy to do that. So yeah, there you go. And the gradient map was just to kind of add a little more, adjust it, I guess. I don't know, however you feel. There's a million ways you could do that. That's how the glow was achieved, and that's how the glow down here under the text was done the same way. The same exact effect by creating a group, putting a black background on it, sending that group to screen do make sure, I don't think I mentioned it, but make sure your blending mode is set to screen, because if it's pass through, yeah, that's what you get. So I hope that taught you something. After the glow, you can go in and apply your text, and I think I just used like a Gotham bold or some pretty simple font. There's a lot of just simple fonts out there, so I'm not going to include the font. Use whatever you would like. You could totally do a different effect. The text here does have an outer glow and a bevel and a gradient overlay just to give it a little more effect. These two layers above it are a metal texture similarly created with the texture you see here, just to kind of blend it in, and it's got a little bit of a red tint to it. And then from there, I adjusted the whole image with some curves and gradient map adjustment layers to kind of just tweak it a little bit. And so I hope I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial on how to create this great metal texture effect within Photoshop. My name is Matt, and I'm with Creative 8. Please share and subscribe, and leave some comments. I look forward to it. Thank you.